audio.
I think ideas are quite easy. Coming up with ideas, it happens all the time. Like, I see it all the time. But then living out that idea and getting other people to believe in that idea is the true challenge of creativity.
Hey y'all, welcome back to The Struggle. I'm Ryan, I'm your host. I'm so happy you're here. It is mid-December now, and it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. And all the stress and craziness that comes with that, at least in my household with a couple young kids. But it's also a great time to reflect and to appreciate the year that we've had. And in context of this podcast, a year of adventure, of pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones, of trying new things, hopefully scoring some wins, and certainly having plenty of struggles along the way. And I'm really happy to bring you this episode today with Fitz Cahall. I'm sure you know Fitz Cahall if you've been listening to podcasts at all over the last, 15, 18 years he's been doing the Dirtbag Diaries. It is the OG, the original adventure podcast, and along with his company and his team over there, including his wife at Duct Tape Then Beer, we've got Climbing Gold, which is a fantastic podcast that he does with Alex Honnold, and so many other things that Fitz puts out. He's a creative powerhouse. He's also an adventurer, an all-rounder, if you will. The guy loves to ski, he loves to hike, he loves to climb. There's a lot that he enjoys doing outside, and we dig into all of that today through the lens of this fantastic book that he compiled and wrote along with his wife, Becca. I got a copy recently, and it has been my nightly read for the past couple of months, actually. And it's just wonderful. It's called States of Adventure, 30 outdoor adventure stories about finding yourself by getting lost. It's the holiday season right now, so if you're into gift giving or gift getting, I would add States of Adventure to your list. The photos are beautiful, and the stories in there, the adventures that Fitz highlights, are just super inspiring and engaging. And it's not all about climbing. It's about a million different things that you can do outside, climbing included. And I just find it to be a wonderful nightly meditation that I read before bed. And it also has given me a lot of great ideas for adventures that I want to go on myself. I feel like this conversation here is a bit of a roadmap for living a life of adventure and purpose and intention and creativity. Fitz is a weekend warrior. He's a dad. And he's had some pretty incredible times out in the natural world. We talk about his climbing, his earlier days of climbing that were a bit riskier when he was into free soloing and heady trad climbing, up until now more recent, where he's finding just as much adventure, type 2 fun, type 3 fun, while doing it as a dad, just in an afternoon. I really loved this adventure, and I think you will too. Just a quick little note for me here. As you are listening to this, I am going to be flying out west, and I'm meeting up with Tom Randall and Anna Hazelnut on two separate days. I'm doing a couple films that I'm making with those two for the show, which you will see this spring. I'm super excited. And speaking of adventures, like I am here with Fitz, and maybe pushing outside of the comfort zone, going for a little type 2 fun, I'm going to be doing that with Tom on some off-wit and some crack climbing. Not my usual cup of tea, as I typically climb the steep stuff out here at the Red, but kind of getting back to my roots. I started as a trad climber, hand jamming my way up granite in Southern California, and now I'm going to be heading out to the desert. Super excited. Haven't climbed in Moab, so going to be doing that, and then heading out to do some climbing with Anna in Vegas. Oh, I'm really excited. I'll keep you posted on that in like a future blog or a newsletter. So if you don't subscribe to the newsletter, pop over and just add your name on the website at thestruggleclimbingshow.com. I send one of those out every month, once a month, with some behind the scenes stuff and some special deals from sponsors and that kind of thing. So check that out. And this is the second to last episode that we're going to be running this year. We'll have one more and then take a couple weeks to just recover and relax and reflect. And then I've already got some bangers lined up for the new year. So thank you so much for all of your support. So many new patrons have come aboard. You guys are the best. All of you, just whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you for listening to this show and for living your life of adventure. And let's get into all of those states right now with Fitz Cahall. It's great to officially meet you. Thanks for all the fantastic storytelling and contributions you've had in this world, climbing, outdoors, adventure, and all that. You've been a real inspiration, dude.
Thanks for having me. I'm psyched to be here. I feel like I had a little bit of like imposter syndrome crop up. I was like, what? Like, this is so cool to be on The Struggle. So, you have such incredible people on the show. So thanks for including me.
Well, I appreciate it. It's such a great community. I've gained so much. My wife calls this like the most expensive way to meet my climbing heroes ever. Because I've got some sponsors and I've got some patrons, which are great. But if I were to divide it up into like the hours that I put into it and then the money that I bring in for some free shoes and some protein powders and stuff like that, I'm probably making less than I did when I was in college, but I'm having the time of my life. So I'm really enjoying it.
Well, that's awesome. And it's like, sometimes you just got to make leaps like that and you don't know where it's going to go. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk with you about a lot of that and leaps, not just into storytelling, but into different adventures. I got a copy of States of Adventure, this book that you put together, and it's been like my nightly ritual. I read one of these stories a night. I have for the past few weeks here, so I'm almost all the way through, as there's 30 stories in there, and then I'll probably just start back at the beginning. But it's just perfect. Like, the length of the stories are contained. Many of them I've recognized from some of my favorite Dirtbag Diaries episodes in the past, but they're told in a new way and condensed, and there's gorgeous photos behind it. So, man, I've really been enjoying it. I'm sure it was a heavy lift for you to put this thing together.
Yeah, it was an awesome process to go through because it's been 18 years. And I think that the book itself probably drew from about 17 years worth of stories just from like the publication cycle. But yeah, it was like an awesome process to go back and look because I don't know, you don't realize like that much time has elapsed or that many stories have gone through the whole thing. So we did it. It was, Becca, who's my wife and business partner, it's like my name's on the book, but we really did it together. She edited like the vast majority of it alongside with the publisher. But, it's like this thing that we had created together. And I think you probably know this is like you just get in the cycle of like, oh, I'm releasing a new episode, on to the next thing, figure it out, go from there. And there's really few moments where you actually get a chance to sort of take a look at your career and like what you've, put so many hours into. And I don't know, it created a deep feeling of gratitude for like the experience that I've had creating both with the Dirtbag Diaries, but also with like our bigger company, Duct Tape Them Beer. So yeah, it's been a cool process. We just had our first, the book came out in late July, but just because everyone's like summers are so busy, we just did our first like book launch party with like actual live crowds. And, I've got a couple events coming up, a live Dirtbag Diaries, like all that. And it's been great to actually sit down and have people come up and sign the book. And, it feels good to be a part of this community. And, sometimes I think in the day-to-day, I can kind of forget that.
Yeah.
So that's been a rad process.
Congratulations. I mean, yeah, it is such a hustle and there's such fast turnover in the kind of work that we do to have something tangible, this physical book that encapsulates some of your favorite stories. And I'm excited to dive into some of those in a little bit here and even try to understand how one chooses just 30 from the hundreds that you've been able to tell over these years. But to just take that breath and recognize this impact that you've had on the community, the personalities and the stories that you've given a bit of a platform to, shown a little bit of a spotlight on, and then to, really celebrate that with you and Becca and the whole team. I'm sure it's been really cool. So congratulations. I'm really excited. I figure I'll kind of break this interview up into a couple parts here. I don't want to treat this like a typical kind of like athlete interview where we're just talking about, how you're dialing in your nutrition for the next big send. Although we can talk about that a little bit. I'm excited to geek out over climbing for a bit here.
My nutrition is not that dialed. I'll be honest.
Right. When beer is in the name of the company, your priorities are in the right place, which is great because I'm a weekend warrior and most of the people who are listening are as well. So I do want to explore the book in depth. But I want to put a pin in that for a second and first talk about climbing and adventure. And we'll enter into that where we always do, which is through struggle. And so I'm curious from your point of view, just speaking of you first here specifically, how you consider this word struggle or this experience. What's your relationship with struggle as a climber and maybe beyond, just kind of as an adventurer in general?
I think when I look at it, it's a word that I think has changed so much like as I've aged through life too, of like what for me, like in all that I do, because like for me, creativity and adventure they're just completely intertwined. And I am like the person that like you show me a map, you show me a guidebook, and it's like my mind starts spinning in the same way that I do when I work on creative endeavors, whether that's writing, whether it's podcasting, whether it's film. And for me, I think it's so much of it is this chance to invite that into your life. You know, I mean, I think a lot of us are like sometimes like pretty privileged and pretty lucky situations, right? Where, you know, my life isn't perfect by any means. Like I've gone through difficult chapters of it. But I think the ability to take some of this and say, I'm going to challenge myself in a way. Like I'm going to put myself in a situation to grow or to maybe ask myself, like, could I do something like this? Like, could I shape my life ever so slightly different to kind of live it in the vision that I want it to be? And that is like very much like a part of it. And like sometimes like I invite that into my life through like the physicality of adventure. Like for me, it's right now, like I still climb super avidly. It's like how I stay sane. I go to the gym all the time. I take my kids climbing outside all the time. I get some big days outside, but like for me, it's like this very much like, you know, 4 days a week, I'm there. It resets my mind. It's incredible. But like, I don't always find myself pushing myself as hard in climbing as I used to. Like I haven't taken on huge projects with it. But for me, it's like a lot of it lately has been like about riding bikes in the mountains, figuring out these like multi-day kind of like alpinism trips with bikes where it's these like difficult things. And I just like love that and inviting that into my life where it's like, I don't know if this will work. I know it's going to physically challenge me. I know it's probably going to mentally challenge me at some point, like where my nutrition will break down, right? You know, and like I'll have these like moments. And I don't know, I love it as much as I ever had. And I think, you know, in my younger years, sometimes I would get into those situations because I didn't know enough and I sort of would figure out how to get into them. And now I think as I age, I look for sometimes situations where I'm like, oh, I know I'm putting myself in the deep end right now and I'm comfortable with that experience and I don't judge it based upon necessarily the outcomes other than I've like tried to go do something that to me feels proud. And I love that. And I think that even on a bigger level, like, that has been a reflection of, you know, how Becca and I have really like chosen to try to live our lives. You know, like I was very lucky in terms of like when I started creating online, when I started the Dirtbag Diaries, like it was this moment where there wasn't a lot of pressure. There was very few people doing it. There wasn't a lot of money in it, but there was like infinite creativity and what you could imagine. And a lot of it no one had done before. And to be in those situations, it was awesome, and you had to be scrappy, and you had to like take all that and figure it out. And then there became a point where it was like, okay, now it's like people understand what YouTube is, people understand what a podcast is, and like how do you figure out how to like, if I want to do this every day of my life, like in terms of for like a career, like how do we make this happen? And how do you do it? How do you stay true to yourself? And somehow that is the struggle, and it's this beautiful one for us that we've taken on where we've just decided like, you know, on a level, it feels like art, I guess, in a way to me. And I know that's funny to say that, like it seems sort of like pretentious to like put that, but there was a moment where we just realized like, no, we've kind of created this thing that we've manifested what was inside of us into the world, and it's connected with people, and like that in my mind is art. And that's a challenge to do in life, and I've loved it. And I think for me, that's, you know, it's like I kind of look at those two struggles. I look at the side that I get from being outside where I can test myself and challenge myself, but then I look at this sort of daily kind of practice of trying to live out my vision of my creativity on a daily basis. And I think, you know, both of those, I'm fortunate enough that I get to accept those struggles into my life, but those are the kind of two twin ways I think of it.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective. You're a masochist then. So you'll take the struggle on out on the mountains, and then you'll take it on into the work environment as well, which I've done as well. And I do think there's a personality type for climbers and, you know, a lot of outdoor adventurers. And I predominantly talk with climbers here on the show where we are a little bit of gluttons for punishment. We like the type 2 fun.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm curious, like, as you look kind of at those parallels, I've never really thought about my creative life as type 2 fun, but I certainly like to enter into things, not just out on rock, but also professionally where the outcome is uncertain. And I don't know if that would be like type 2 fun or not, because there's a certain level of suffering that comes with type 2 fun. It's like more enjoyable in retrospect, to some extent. And, how does that strike you? Does that carry over? Is there a type 2 equivalent to being a creative?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely think so. And I think there's probably even like type 3 versions of it too as well. But
Right.
Yeah, no, I think it does, because it does, like, that idea of being sort of willing to live in a place of uncertainty is very much part of any creative endeavor. That's kind of like that whole idea, right? There's the trope of the starving artist. I don't think that's always the case, right? Like, hopefully that's not the case. I would say if people are creatives out there that are trying to just like, don't set the bar of starving for your like work, because people will value it and they will, care about it. And there's a lot of good examples of that. But there is that idea, right? Like, one thing I think about is I think ideas are quite easy. I think coming up with ideas, it happens all the time. Like, I see it all the time. But then living out that idea and getting other people to believe in that idea is the true challenge of creativity. Because the ideas happen all the time. You talk to anyone, they're like, I got this idea. And then how does that idea go from into a reality? And that can be a painful process, like a very rewarding one, but it's like, you don't always know. Like, there's just like periods of time where you're like, will I be doing this a year from now? And to be like raising a family doing something like that is like a trick. So there is that side of like, you have to accept some level of like uncertainty and discomfort in the whole thing. And I think that the truth of it is like, the same is true for people that aren't doing creativity. Is like, sometimes it just seems more secure, but in the reality is like as humans, like, things change. We get sick. Random things happen to us, right? So you don't really totally know if you're secure in life, right? I think that is like the truth of the whole thing. But it is particularly true when you do something in the creative fields where you're like, wow, okay, cool. Well, I feel this compulsion to try this thing, but I need to be comfortable with the fact that I don't know the outcome of it. And so for me, that is the complete like overlap between climbing, where, you're trying to put up a first ascent or something like that, or you're trying a project that's at your limit, is that you could spend years beating your head against a wall, or, you could find yourself in a scary situation in the mountains, like whatever it is. But to look up at a route and say, I want to go up and I'm going to do my best to get there, like in whatever the discipline, it's a magical thing that you can take and apply to the rest of your life. And it doesn't necessarily mean to be like in creativity. I think that there's an amazing thing of like, I'm surrounded here in Seattle by a lot of climbers who have had deep, lifelong relationships with the sport, who also happen to be entrepreneurs who've like done this. And I think they kind of gain some of that confidence to sort of go out on their own and do their own thing through some of those lessons that they learned through climbing. And so I think that there are completely teachable sides from our sport, no matter like whether you're bouldering, whether you're sport climbing, whether you're alpine climbing, whether you're trad climbing, like there are lessons that if you are willing to think about how they apply to your life, you can take them and use them as incredible guardrails for navigating like life in the flatlands or life in the horizontal versus life in the vertical.
Let's talk about shoes for a second here, because this episode is supported by SCARPA, and they just make the absolute best shoes in the game. Oh my gosh, I love them so much. I have been climbing in SCARPAs for a decade now, and I just love the way that they fit and they perform on rock and also at the gym. I've been loving the Instincts, the VSs and the VSRs on my project out at the Red, because they can toe into those little pockets and stand on edges so well. They heel hook like a dream. And then in the gym, as I've been climbing on the moonboard and the gym set problems, I've been using their Veloce Ls, the lace-ups. They're soft. Oh my gosh, you can just feel everything. They're super dynamic. I feel really athletic in them. So look, whether you're a weekend warrior like me who's just trying to get the most out of my time at the gym and out on the crag, or a pro like Sean Rabitou or Nina Williams, Nathaniel Coleman, Alex Puccio, Jordan Cannon, or Matty Hong, holy smokes, what a team. SCARPA's got you covered. They've been sustainably making the best dang footwear for climbers, trail runners, and skiers since 1938. I love my approach shoes. I love my climbing shoes. And I think you will too. Give them a shot. You can shop the whole collection over at scarpa.com. SCARPA, no place too far. Quick question for you, climber friend. What's the first thing you do when you fall off of a climb? Whether you're at the gym or you're outside, you fall and you look at your hands, right? You look at your hands and you say, why have you failed me, hands? And you take a look at your skin and you say, come on, skin, can you give me one more go? Well, the answer is yes. If you are using Rhino Skin Solutions, I'm so psyched to be partnered with Rhino. I've been using Rhino forever. As a climber, it's made by climbers for your adventures. And what do I use? Well, I use their performance cream every night before I go to bed. It soothes and strengthens my skin. And then when I'm in season and I really want to keep my skin very dry so that I can keep a hold on those tiny little holds on my project, I'm going to use their dry spray. So that keeps my skin from sweating as much. And then after I get off of a climb and I'm done for the day at the gym or out at the crag, I clean my hands really well. I use their cleanse spray, which doesn't require any other water. So if I'm out in the woods, I can just clean my hands real quick out at the crag. And then I'm immediately putting that repair cream on to get my skin back to health after drying it out so much with all that chalk all day. Look, whether you climb a lot in the gym on the plastic holds or you climb a lot outside, taking care of your skin is going to not only help you to be able to put in more quality sessions, but also it might be the difference in whether you send or not. So take care of that skin and take care of your wallet, because Rhino's going to give you 20% off just for being a Struggle listener. If you go to thestruggleclimbingshow.com/Rhino, that code will be preloaded to give you 20% off, or just use code STRUGGLE at checkout over at rhinoskinsolutions.com. Let's go. Well, let's talk about climbing for a little bit and just kind of geek out and get specific about climbing. And then I'll broaden it out into some of these greater adventures that you've highlighted in the book here, which I really enjoyed. But yeah, as a climbing chapter here, well, first of all, Fitz, how would you define yourself as a climber? If you had to throw yourself into a box, what kind of climber are you?
Oh, I was kind of like a trad climber. I really liked free climbing. Like I liked the process of figuring out how to make a pitch happen, you know, in terms of like gear placements and sort of that side of it. I loved bouldering too. I loved highball bouldering in particular, just because like that demanded so much of like concentration. And when I was younger, I really loved free solo climbing too. Like I did quite a bit of that when I was younger, and, you know, ultimately like kind of let that go in order to kind of pursue the life that I wanted to lead and like the personal side of my world. And I really like sport climbing, especially like when you get to do it on great limestone or something like that. But I didn't excel at the whole like siege something that was at your upper limit. Like I could onsite something, or I was pretty psyched if I could do it in like 3 or 4 goes. But I did a few kind of like bigger projects I would feel like where I was like, oh, this took 20 goes or something to maybe get through some of the grades. But I sort of capped at this level where I started to lose interest a little bit in some of the sport climbing, because it just felt sort of repetitive and like it just felt like a grind in a way that some of the other aspects of climbing didn't feel like that to me.
Yeah, interesting. A few of the disciplines you noted there, from highballing to free soloing and even trad, those on the spectrum of safety, if you will, would be, you know, more to the riskier side. Mm-hmm. Of course, that all depends on the challenge level of the climb that you're taking on. If you're highballing or free soloing or trad climbing well below your limit, then maybe it's not so risky. But is there a common thread there? Is there something about the risk of taking on something with high potential consequence that you feel drew you to those styles of climbing, at least in your earlier years?
Yeah, I mean, you can say like, oh, this thing interests me, right? Like you can go through that process and sort of say like, oh yeah, I think free soloing is cool, or, you know, I think runout trad climbing is cool. And I like, the reality is like, you can be drawn to that, but once you do it, you're going to quickly find, you either like, you're going to like be engaged by that or you're not. It's like, there's a really clear feedback that happens from it.
Right.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that I was like drawn to that right out of the gate. It was something that I realized, like, especially as like I understood myself as an athlete and like what my certain skill sets were. It was like, you know, I was really good at sort of staying calm, and I was really good at sort of the presence and the focus that was required to do a lot of that stuff. And then, I mean, you know, it was also just like, I mean, part of it was that I did more of that, so I got better at it, but like I was strong, you know, like my endurance was always like really strong. I kind of had that sort of long distance, like runner strength, like if you could imagine that with like climbing, where it was like, oh, cool, I can stay really calm, like my heart rate's down low. And I did fall in love with the magic of having that just like very sharp focus that could come. Not every day. Like some days I'd be like, man, I'm just like, I can't handle this. There'd be periods of times where I would do one thing more than the other. Once I got deeper into it, like I'd say like once I was like 4 or 5 years into the sport, I was like, yes, this is like, and part of it's like you do what you're good at, right? Or like what you feel like you're good at. But it was also really pretty engaging to me. And I think that, you can think like, oh yeah, like that'll be badass if I go do it, but you go do it. And sometimes like some people are like, man, that sucks, or I'm not into that at all.
Right.
And to me, some of that stuff did feel, I don't know, there just were a lot of like really magical memories that came out of that for me. And some of them came with quite a lot of risk, but I think it was something that I was like careful about inviting into my life and that I knew that I really liked. And then there was a kind of clear moment in my life where it was time to say like, see you later. And that's okay. And that's like magical in that sense too, of just being like, oh, that's just something that I did at a certain period of time. And, like I'm able to kind of move on and take all those learnings and grow from it. Yeah.
Looking back at that chapter, before you kind of closed the page on that, and when you decided to close the page on that, was that when you had kids?
No, it wasn't when I had kids. It was really like, I think that was something that as Becca and I, like, she and I also were like I have had a lot of like climbing partners, but like she and I also were like our main climbing partners, and we would go and put up first ascents out in the mountains. We would like go and take these adventures together, and she was willing to do like a lot of these same things, but I think that there was a level for her where it just, as we were building our life together, I could see that it like placed a toll on her, and that there was this reality. And like, I felt like what we were building together and what we were creating in our late 20s, it was the most special thing in the world to me. And I could see that and I could sense that. And I frankly loved her more than I loved free soloing. And I think I'd done it. Like for me, I felt like I had done the things that felt achievable or like were kind of like realistic. And I think that I wanted to take care of that, the relationship, because I could see how much potential for happiness and joy and human connection there was in that, and how lucky, and I like how still lucky like we are that we like still go do stuff together, like in the mountains. Like we have, kids that are getting older and like busy lives, and like we still make time for that and still like help each other do that. So for me, it felt like maybe a tougher decision at the moment, but like in hindsight, you're like, oh yeah, like if this strengthened your relationship by saying like, hey, I can let this part of my climbing go so that we can go do all these incredible things together, that was, a no-brainer looking back at it.
That's beautiful. Well, I do want to explore more of the relationship aspect there, and I actually had some listeners writing questions about that specifically. But looking back on that chapter, before you turn the page, you mentioned what attracted you most to those styles of climbing were these moments where you could really focus and find a way to remain calm, and whether that's attaining flow or just controlling your emotions and, the mental side of climbing more so maybe than the physical side. Is there a situation, is there an instance that comes to mind where you can kind of bring us back into that moment where you really put all of that to use and kind of achieved that feeling that, drew you to climbing in those riskier situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's funny. I was just like, my mind was spinning as we were like talking about some of that stuff. And, I think one of the first, like for me, one of the first big solos that I did, like, and again, it's for me because like this is such a personal thing. Like to me, it felt pretty like, oh, I'm stepping out a little bit, was this route out in Leavenworth called Outer Space. It's this super classic, like grade 3, kind of like 1,000-foot long, 5.9 plus route. And wow. I had soloed like well harder beyond that sort of point, like where I'd probably at that stage had soloed up to like mid 5'11", but like much closer to the ground, and without like, there's a move on that route where you like kind of come off a ledge and there's just like air underneath you. And I was in college. I was kind of probably like a senior in college, and I just like, had a free afternoon, drove out from Seattle, just like raced out there. And it was just like that kind of perfect fall day. And I think that there were all this like I think it was like cottonwood seeds were in the air, and there was just like this quiet, like still steady updraft. And I remember being 4 or 5 pitches up this thing and just having this like, just this incredible focus and this incredible moment of being like, wow, this is like, I'm capable of something like that. And, like while also being aware of like what I'm doing, has the deepest consequences you could possibly imagine too. And I'm like making a choice, but it's done intentionally. And so for me, like I can feel the finger locks. Like when I think back, like I can like feel the bite, and I can like remember how my like elbow would have turned in. And then like even just like, I think there's like a nub, and I think there's some move where you're kind of like straight in finger locking, and then you would like turn, like maybe go thumb up and then turn and then like reach up, and there's like a big ass jug, and you're kind of like into 5/8 hand cracked, and you're fine. But like the fact that it actually like makes my fingers feel like what it's like to be in a finger lock is incredible. And like the power of that was awesome. And that wasn't something, like that was something I worked up to. Like that was not something that came out of the blue. Like even though that grade is sort of deceiving where it's like, oh, it's only 5.9 plus, it was something like I had done a lot of other soloing at that stage to kind of like work up to be like, okay, now can I apply this to something that's like 1,000 feet tall and kind of like pretty sustained. And so for me, it was like this pretty cool jumping off moment where you could do. And then, it was like all of a sudden it was like kind of building blocks in a way where the year later, it was like the enchantments loops. Most people like do it as a run or hike now, but it's this like incredible 18-mile-ish kind of like route through one of this like little granite wonderlands here in the Cascades. It's super popular these days. But if you look at it right, you can actually like connect all these like super classic climbs through it. And it was like a year later, I was going and like combining, a grade 4 route into, a classic route on Prusik Peak, and then running down the trail and then doing outer space. So I felt like that first big solo for me kind of felt like this like leap off point where I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like this is something that you are good at. And then it was like this magical thing, and it was super powerful to me.
What a cool and poignant experience. I felt like I was there. It's interesting. Just on a very recent episode of Dirtbag Diaries I was listening to, and I'm not even sure which one it was, but your guest was talking about how like a large release of dopamine is connected to memory, like the memory center in the brain.
Yeah.
And, you remembering now 20 some years ago, kind of what the rock felt like and how you were getting these finger locks and twisting into these moves. Like obviously that was like indelibly etched into who you are as a person. And each one of these experiences, as we stack them, they inform who we become as people. And clearly that was a formative one for you there. Yeah. And I'm curious, as now you're not in that season, and I'm not in that season. I got a couple kids. I'm in my 40s, and I'm less risk tolerant, if you will, but I still want to be able to have those experiences. Mm-hmm. And are you still able to create those indelible experiences now without it being like a high consequence activity that you're doing?
It's so interesting. That's a great question. Like, cause you're like, oh, it doesn't mean it's over, right? And one of my like this stage, like I'm a little bit of a homebody, if that makes sense. Like I love where I live. Like I love the Pacific Northwest. I used to travel like tons and tons of work all over the place, which I love that chapter in my life. But like now more and more, I love being here, and I do my best to be here, like to enjoy the kind of the elements of this place, right? And so for me, I climb a lot at Index, which is like 5 minutes away from my house. It's there, and I've climbed there a bunch. That's kind of like where I learned to climb 26 years ago or something like that.
It's hard climbing there, isn't it?
It's hard. It's kind of tricky. It's like kind of like vertical slab, if that makes sense. Like it's not like always like the biggest holds. Like it's a lot of body position and whatnot. And I go and there's the upper wall is big. It's like 600, or it's not giant, but it's like 600 foot kind of like routes, maybe like 800 feet at the biggest. And I'll go up there and I'll top rope solo quite a bit. And I just like, it's kind of like my little thing where it's like, okay, wake up on a Saturday morning and leave the house at 5, and I can, get a good kind of like workout up there, and I can go throw a rope down, and I can get 15 pitches in the morning, and then like be home to go hang out with the kids or something like that. And it's not dangerous at all, right? Like I'm just top roping on these routes. And I think for me, it's wild. Like I've gone through this process of going to the Upper Town Wall and walking up the forest. And at some point I did the calculation and I realized that I'd been doing that long enough that the trees were actually like 20 or 30 feet taller, that the actual forest had grown like through that time and like putting that energy into this thing that I love. And it's wild because like there was a moment, I think it was like maybe 2 summers ago where I was doing a route, I'd done it a bunch, and like it was like one of those moments where I actually like was like, I knew I could take the rope off in that situation. Whereas like, oh yeah, like this, and it was like the same experience. Like I don't even know, that sounds so strange, but just to be like, oh, I've actually just tapped into the same thing that I used to tap into, but I've got this like top rope right here. But like, I just knew I could take it off. Like it was such a crazy moment where you're like, I didn't need the danger to access what that original experience of being ropeless had given me. Like, even though I'm doing like the 40-year-old dad thing, top rope soloing, and here I am, and it's like, I accessed the exact same thing that I did, 2 decades earlier on outer space. Maybe it's like mastery or kind of control or calmness or what a transcendence even. It deeply got me on that level where, yeah. And that's freaking cool. Like, I don't know how many things there are. I mean, there's plenty of things. Probably people find that with ping pong or, knitting or, I mean, I'm not throwing any of those underneath the bus by any means, but like probably people do find it in many different ways in life. But I think climbing has a way of doing that for a lot of us that is particularly pretty powerful.
That moving meditation and just, being able to access flow even if it isn't high consequence. I think, I guess the technical definition of that some would give flow is like when like challenge meets ability or just kind of slightly pushes past ability. But I'm not sure that's always the case for us as climbers, because I've certainly like achieved flow state on warm-up climbs sometimes, and where I'm just like really in tune with like how every joint of my body is moving and, aware of the crystals on the rock. But maybe it's transcendence. Maybe it isn't flow. Maybe it's a different thing that's tangential to flow. But for you to be able to achieve that on top rope solo and to be out in nature, which I'm sure contributes in a high way, just connecting with the trees that have grown up alongside you, that's really beautiful, man. I love that. And I'm constantly looking for that myself, because I'm in a chapter of my life here where with the kids and all the jobs and all of that comes with it, I don't have a lot of opportunity for big days out, big adventures out. Usually one time a year I can take a trip. But for the most part, I'm driving, I'm a couple hours from the Red, and I'll drive out and I'll just day trip out to the Red. And there's fantastic climbing there, of course. But, it's bolted sport routes. And so it's the danger, I guess, isn't there per se. The epicness of doing an 18-hour day or a 23-hour day or whatever it may be, it isn't there. It's been a while since I've had one of those, I guess, climbing epinephrine, where I like basically totally fucking epic down that thing, some years ago. But for the most part, I'm kind of day tripping out there and still getting so much out of climbing. And even when I have days at the gym, like I can have these amazing experiences that I'm so proud of. But when I read a book like you wrote here, or I listen to some of the stories on Dirtbag Diaries, I feel a twinge of envy, a twinge of longing for those kind of big experiences, those big day experiences. But it sounds like from your story right there that even that can be achieved in a few hours before lunch if you just put yourself in the right position for it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes I feel like maybe somebody that is at a different stage in life would be like, oh, you're just sort of watering it down to make it sound better, to like convince yourself or whatnot. And, I've done this enough where I'm like, I don't think that's true. Like, I think we can really make the most of like those moments, and because that's just the reality of like life sometimes, like of where you're at. And we're lucky to even have that. Like, frankly put, we are all like super lucky that we're even worried about having a half day versus a full day, or like, right. Totally. It's just like, it's an amazing thing. So yeah, I don't know. How old are your kids? Like, where are you at this thing?
6 and 9.
Yeah, it'll change. It like this will change. And then before you know it too, it's like your kids will be, your kids are so close to, like, I'm sure that maybe they're even starting to climb and do that. And then that chapter happens where you're just like, wow, this is like wicked, and it's like, to the other day, like my eldest, she did a boulder problem and I was like, I'm not doing that today. I knew that. I was like, yeah, that one's not going down.
How old is she?
Today. He is 12. Yeah, or almost 13. And you're just like, all right, that one's not going down. And the 12-year-old did it. And it was like, that's awesome. And it for me, it's like, that's a cool thing to see, my son on his journey now with the sport too. And like, who knows? Like, I have no idea if that'll stick, but he's psyched. And I never I didn't really ever push either kid into doing these things, but on some level, like, being in natural spaces, it's left a big imprint on them in some regard, one way or the other. And as you roll through it, it's like, it's just wild. It's wild to see the kid. Like, if they actually like take to it and they get there, it's like, you'll be surprised that those bigger days or things are like, they could almost be a part of parenting not that far from now.
Oh, cool, man. That's great to hear. I like a little bit of a peek into the potential future here. And I do get my kids out to the red as much as possible. I was just out there with my son a couple days ago, and it's a bit of a junk show. And I certainly don't get my pitches in that I would typically want, but we spent 2 hours catching crawdads in the creek, and that was cool too, because that's something I've never done. I go out to the red and I'm like, focused on the project and singularly kind of driven to perform, and am I resting enough? And like, here we were, like, we spent 2 hours just turning over rocks in the creek, and that was a great time as well. So I think kids, as much as I want to invite them out into my world, it's cool that they can invite me into their world as well. And I can just go out and have a totally different day out at the crag than I would otherwise.
I mean, right. I think that's like also part of like, I think the allure of the climbing, like you were talking about, like epinephrine, and I loved climbing at Red Rocks. Like, that was one of my favorite, or like still is. Like, I haven't been in a hot second, but I love climbing there. I love those canyons. And I just, like, one of my favorite parts about it is like, you top something out, you'd top something out on the rainbow wall, or like the levitation, and you end up like way high up there, and you have to like come down the canyon. And I always, I'd be like so grungy, so like, just so dirtbag, like smelly, and you'd find some like perfect pool, like in the little bottom of the canyon. You'd be like, like I get to go swimming, and you would find, I loved that, especially like the years that I was climbing a lot in the Southwest, is how some of the bigger routes would take you to these incredible like small moments. I got to do this story for like Climbing Magazine about these sort of almost like alpine ridges in Zion, where it was, typically people think of like Moonlight Buttress or like kind of easier wall climbing when they think of Zion, but there was a bunch of these like kind of like really like scrambly, cool, some of them you could kind of like free solo, but there might be like a few pitches of like 5'9" or something like that, or like little boulder problems here and there. It was like a really neat project to work on, but they would get you to these tops of these summits. And then you would end up in the coolest places in these like little magical moments that I don't think I would have ever invited into my life. Like, if you've been like, oh yeah, you have to hike 4 hours up some gully to go see this incredible panel of petroglyphs, or you need to go figure out how to canyoneer to end up in a canyon. And I think that was one of the coolest things, is that climbing like led me to some of those like small moments, much like the crawfish thing, where you're like, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the climbing. And yet this is just like icing on the cake, having these like little extra moments. And I think that's kind of what happens with the kids. We don't need to turn it into the dad podcast, but like, we've been climbing out at Index quite a bit, and our jam is kind of like climb in the morning. We get as many pitches as we can within like what's reasonable. And then there's this incredible like swimming hole. Just, we go, there's a little tiny like little market in the town of Index. So we like leave the crag, go get ice cream, go to the swimming hole, hang out at the swimming hole. And in September, there's salmon in the bottom of it. And cool. The kids just like are jumping off the rocks, and like salmon are like skittering everywhere. And you're just like, what a rad thing. And so I think that it's like the sum of all the parts, right, that of where the journey can take us, that is really super special about the sport of climbing. And, everyone's got their own relationship with it, but sometimes I think people can forget to see the forest for the trees, like when they think about performance or think about succeeding on those routes. And if you can take a step back and just sort of like look at what it gives you, like the places it takes you, the friendships it gives, just the it's rad. It's a rad thing.
This episode is supported by Rungni, which of course is Magnus Mitbo's brand, and they make rad clothing and high-performance chalk at really affordable prices, you guys. I've been using their chalk Magdust for a while now, and it's awesome stuff. Whether I'm struggling outside on my project or struggling inside on the set problems at my gym, Magdust feels fantastic. It's been working great for me, it performs awesome, and it's affordable. It's at the top of a ton of best of lists. Loads of pros are using it. I think you're going to love it as well. You can score a bundle to keep your bucket or chalk bag full for an entire season, and it is not going to break the bank. Plus, right now, y'all, you can hit the link in the show notes for a chance to win a year's supply of Magdust chalk, plus all sorts of other cool discounts and prizes. It's all over at rungni.com, RUNGNE.com, but use that link in your show notes because that's how you can score that year's supply of chalk. Y'all, I just want to give a little shout out here to PhysiVantage, the official climbing nutrition sponsor of The Struggle. I have been a paying customer of PhysiVantage for a couple of years now, and this stuff is truly the best of the best if y'all want to level up your training and your performance, and I know you do. I'll give you a little window into my routine here. There are a few PhysiVantage products that I take every day, whether I climb or not. First, I start my day with their superfood greens, which taste delicious and is just the best way for me to get going in the morning. It supports my immune system and my digestive health. I just always feel like I'm good as long as I start my day with their greens. I also take their magnesium supplement every day, MagATP, which, as it turns out, and I didn't know this, a lot of people are deficient in, and among other things, it helps me to improve my sleep, which of course is really important for recovery. Lastly, I take their supercharged collagen every day as well to support my tendons and ligaments so that I can train harder and recover faster. It is all science-backed stuff. It tastes delicious, which I think is also very important. And I can also say with absolute sincerity that I'm training harder right now than I ever have before, and I have never felt better. And I attribute that a lot to PhysiVantage and how it's helping me to recover and perform my best. So if you're looking for that extra edge, hit the link in your podcast app or use checkout code STRUGGLE15 to save 15% off any full-price nutrition order at PhysiVantage.com. I really think you're going to feel the difference. Check it out. I'm finding this conversation so refreshing and well-timed because I am in like a very obsessed moment of my climbing career, which I love and I get a lot of fulfillment from, but it's great to be able to reconnect and tap into just these experiences that we can have out where we're not trying to push our physical or mental limit, but we're just connecting, whether it's with the community, our kids, friends, just nature itself, man. That's beautiful. And I think a great segue for us to talk about the States of Adventure here, which I've just absolutely loved. As I said, I've been reading like one of these stories a night, every night, and I've got a lot of dog-eared pages. I want to talk with you about some of these things specifically, but the kind of sub-headline here is, as I'm reading it, 30 outdoor adventure stories about finding yourself by getting lost. And I love that. I love finding yourself by getting lost. Tell me about that. Tell me about, why these 30, and you've also broken the book up into a few sections, if you will. Yeah. And I'm curious the thought process behind that.
I think it's a couple of things. Like when you look at the Dirtbag Diaries and like look at all the stories you tell, is you begin to see a template for life. Like it's this really interesting thing. Like the characters change, the sort of situations of the characters, the background, the context, what they're experiencing. That might change, but there is sort of like an actual template for living this life that is like very full, very engaged with nature, very engaged with our community, with our friends, with ourselves, right? And that's what we tried to do with the book. Like it's clear in the show and hopefully we kind of achieved, but it's like, it didn't work out quite as perfectly as I wanted to, but it mostly did, where you can see these different chapters of a life and go through that. And I think that there is so much, in our world where I think maybe it's like more in the culture now, but like when I started this project and like kind of when I came up, there was so much around this, like was about like, you go, you do a thing, there's a process to it, you get a job, you go this certain way, you make sure you do all these things, and it's kind of not a lot of like wiggle room in the whole thing. Or at least that's kind of what some of my experience was. And I didn't grow up in like a super conformist household or anything like that, but you do realize like there are sort of grooves through this life that a lot of us follow and a lot of us are put on, right? And for me, I think that was like the sort of the magic is like I followed this curiosity that I had about climbing, about myself, and it didn't make sense to the people that raised me or the people that I was surrounded by always, it didn't always make sense to me. But at the same point, I felt drawn to it and I felt curious about it. And I let myself kind of chase that. And that to me was this really powerful thing. And there's certainly like a version of this where I didn't get to make a career out of it, or I didn't do it. But even then, like, even if I like had gone through that sort of early chapter and not done it, I know I would have been transformed by it. I know it would have, like, those moments that meant so much to me, those friendships, that they would have had an impact on no matter where I did with my life. So I think that in our worlds, we're always kind of like looking for the next chapter. We're always looking forward to that. Whether that's like, you're like, what am I, graduating college, or what am I going to do next? Like, oh, I'm on to the next thing. And we're always kind of, as humans, we're always kind of looking for that. Even like, oh, will I be able to have like a big day in the mountains again? And the whole thing is that the show is right now. Like, the main event is happening right now for us. And like, I think that like layers, like, if you are curious about something, follow it. And I think that a lot of times, like, the people around you will often support you in that endeavor to a way. And so I think that that's like a nod, like particularly in the younger years of the Dirtbag Diaries, like it was being shared. We had a lot of kids in college listening because it was like clunky technology. You had to like download it to your computer. You either burned it onto a CD or you like put it onto a first gen iPod. There were like, it was like super clunky, not a first gen iPod, but like pretty close to it. Like it was a pretty clunky thing. And so we ended up having like a lot of the young people listening to the show. And I feel like one of the things that happened and I've been able to hear back is like, on a level, is like my own story of kind of following or trying to follow curiosity resonated with a lot of people, and that they actually made leaps on their own to follow similar courses that have, ended up working out, because I just think that tends to end up working out, maybe not in the way you imagined or like what you necessarily want to be, but if you are truly curious about something, you'll find yourself in a place you didn't imagine being. And I think that's like one of the beauties of life.
Hear to that. And I have gleaned that myself, just in these stories are very different. So for the listener who hasn't opened these pages, certainly you've listened to Dirtbag Diaries or are familiar with it at least. It's not all climbing content. There's climbing in there, but there's a story about a lady who hiked with her dog, got the second through hike on this trail in Minnesota, like in the winter, and it was negative 30 degrees. And there was a kid, this little girl, who paddled the Grand Canyon. And, it's young and old and men and women and all sorts of different variety of sports. And there is that passion that comes through, and just kind of like finding the thing that ignites this fire within you and just doing it and just finding a way to do it. Like the woman who did the trail with the dog was like, I forgot what she did. She's like worked security or something like that. And
she's a gardener.
Gardener.
Yeah,
landscaper.
Landscaper. Yeah.
This was like her vacation. She like took like 60 days off to basically, do the hardest thing that you could ever, like the most uncomfortable thing that you could ever imagine. And obviously in the process learned so much about herself.
And the coolest thing is that it's funny that Emily Ford, did this thing. She just had no idea, someone loaned her the dog. It was actually like a sled dog, and someone was like, well, that might be like not a bad thing to have if you're kind of traversing Wisconsin in the middle of the winter.
Right.
You might want like a little company or something like that. So someone loaned her the dog, and, now the dog they're still attached. The person gave her the dog, which is awesome. But like Emily's actually getting ready to go do the Iditarod.
Wow.
So here's this person that's gone from like, I don't know anything about that, not anything about it, but like, I don't know much about this, but like, I just followed this curiosity, and now she's going to go be like, run a dog sled team on one of the most iconic races in the world, period.
Yeah.
And that's wicked, right? And that comes from that basis of just being like, well, could I do that? And just going and finding out. And, that's amazing. And I think that's just like, I hope that if there's one thing that our work could do is like sometimes give that little nudge or that little bit of a kick in the ass to kind of just be like, don't think about this stuff too long. Go and just try it and see what happens.
Yes, dude. I'm so fired up right now just like talking with you about it. And then when I read it or I hear about it on the show, it absolutely does that. You posed that rhetorical question, could I do that? And like the answer is like, yes, you can do it. That's the craziest thing. Like it doesn't, I mean, there are factors in one's life that need to be worked out. But what these stories show is that you can do it. It's not, these adventures aren't reserved only for the elite who are rich, who can take off time whenever they want. Maybe that was the case back in the day, or for taking on the big mountains, or for certainly, for some objectives still these days, one needs to come from like an incredible amount of privilege for the most part. But to right out your back door, push yourself into these adventures that are life-changing. I think that's available. It seems like that's available in pretty much every state in this country, or every backyard wherever you live in the world.
Well, and the thing about it too is I think that sometimes we put like our sort of heroes or like our premier athletes or we put them up on pedestals, and some of them are like athletically predisposed. And I think there's like the reality of like, not everyone's going to climb 515C. Like it's like the gap to get to 515C is not just entirely like work ethic or circumstances, right? That's a reality. But I think that in general, like I think sometimes we think there's some sort of magic sauce that those people have that we don't. And I want to say that is like a fallacy, as that is contained in each of us. And it's just that they followed that innate curiosity. They had it, and it had the motivation to go do that, which some people don't have too. You might be like, oh, I want to go do that, but you don't actually truly have the motivation. And that's fine. Don't beat yourself up over that. Like, that's okay. But like the things that you're like compelling, like if you're like drawn to something, you keep thinking about it, like don't keep thinking about it. Like go act on it, because like that's ultimately like every single person you admire had that same exact experience where they thought about something, and they said, I should just go act on it. And they go act on it. And some of them were successful, some of them weren't. Like most of the time, they probably tried to act on it the first time and it didn't work. And they tried it the second time and it didn't work. And they tried the third time and it did. And then they got better at that process, and they just kept repeating it. And they kept building the skills and kept building the experience level and the calmness and the sort of like comfort with discomfort that comes from trying difficult things with your life. And then all of a sudden you're like, you have access to that. And I think that's like an important reminder, is that, like a lot of this in this space, while some of it's a function of like athletic ability, it's more of a function of like creative belief or persistence. And I think that's like, I don't know. It's awesome to meet your heroes, but I think that it's also like important to realize like they're just like you, they're just like us. That's the reality. There's like a method to the madness, I guess.
They just said yes. They just went out there and leapt and did it. And and often failed and got back up and kept trying. If you look at Tommy on the Don Wall, or even Alex on El Cap, and so many other objectives that seemed impossible actually were impossible for a while, until they became possible. And we can have that version of ourselves. As you're saying, we may not climb, 515, but there's something right out our back door that can give us the experience and the growth that taking on something like that would do as well. And, some of these stories that you have in the book here are yours. So you're featuring, stories, people, guests from the Dirtbag Diaries, but you're also interweaving some of these formative experiences that you've had out there. One of them really stood out to me. Maybe it's because of where I'm at in my life. It just really resonated with me. Do you have a copy of the book? I want you to read a chunk for me.
I can grab it. It's right outside the door. I'll go grab it.
Yeah, go ahead and grab it. All right. Page 85, in a story that you've titled Unseen But Felt by Fitz Cahall. You're in the Sierras, you're with Becca, and kind of set the stage here. I think you're on the John Muir Trail, right, hiking, and the weather has turned sour. It seems like Becca's had an injury. You guys have been getting beat up a little bit here. And I'd love for you to read from that second section on the second sentence there. Maybe this jumped out to me because of the word struggles right there in there. But if you could read from that just to the end of that section there, and then we can kind of talk through what happened next.
After years of struggling, my career was moving forward at light speed, but demanded what felt like unwavering commitment. I was drinking too much, not sleeping enough. The specter of depression and burnout tapped at my shoulder. Beyond that, questions hovered over mine and Becca's shared life. Could we ever buy a house? Could we afford to start a family one day? Would it just be simpler to walk away from the creative chaos to get a 9-to-5 with steady hours and good health care? I hoped a heavy pack and 50-ish days in the mountains might serve as a lightning strike to clarity.
Yeah, take us back there for a second, if you would, because
yeah.
I think we all experience that version of what you were feeling, whether we're students in school and we're feeling a ton of pressure with finals, or what's our career going to be, and expectations from family or friends, or we're newly married couples and we're trying to make our stamp in the world, or we're where I'm at, where I've got kids and I'm like frazzled and constantly worried about finances, and maybe more similarly can relate exactly to what you wrote there, because I'm also in a creative career. But I think it's relatable, regardless. For many people who are listening, we probably have a lot going on. We're feeling stressed. And you're saying that you hoped a heavy pack and 50-ish days in the mountains might serve as a lightning strike of clarity.
Yeah.
So yeah, take me into that moment and kind of what did come from this adventure that you had.
Well, I would say that, it's like looking back, that trip is one of the, I think we gave ourselves permission to do that, which at that stage in our life where we were in our late 20s and really things had shifted, it was really things were taking off in the career, but it was still at that early point where it was hard to figure, I knew that this would be sustainable on some level, financially, but it wasn't quite at that point. I didn't have a background in business. Becca didn't have a background in business. We were figuring it out. So there was that trick. There was a lot of uncertainty. Fortunately, I had some friends that were better at that stuff that told me no, that just were encouraging of no, you got this. Just go apply for a loan or do whatever, so that stuff happened. But at that moment in time, I think I just, I was a little bit burnout from working so hard and from trying so hard at it. And there had been other people that had taken journeys in the Sierra like this, where they had been oh, why bother with just going in and doing one route? Why not just stay out there the entire time and do as many routes as you could? And that's the sort of the beginnings of the John Muir Trail. That David Brower, who was a conservationist at the Sierra Club, who I, admired, had done a similar trip. I'd met this awesome woman in Yosemite who was, maybe 20 years older than me at the time. She was probably in her mid 40s, who was working as a scientist, who had done a similar trip. I can't remember her name, but I just remember being you and your husband, that sounds awesome. And so I think this trip had always there, and it's sort of been in the back of my mind. And, we gave ourselves this sort of permission to be hey, there's this thing. We got to figure some things out. We got to work ahead, make it all happen. I mean, for that point, it was I actually had to have someone post the podcast for me. It was the first time we paid somebody to do something else for us. Oh, that was maybe not the first time, but it was someone was how are you posting to social media while you're gone? I was oh, I just paid someone to do that. It was
right.
It was kind of one of those things where you're you can do that? You're yeah, you can do that. And we took this incredible trip, kind of starting down in the southern portion of Kings Canyon, Sequoia, and made our way north over the course of it probably was 6 or 7 weeks. And we were able to, repeat some classic routes that were, super easy. We were able to put up some first ascents, and we it was a full ass kicker. I would not be I would not do that trip the same way again. I'd be oh, there's better ways to do that, versus the way we went through the whole thing. But it was awesome. And it was it was really difficult. I mean, we had it's so funny. I'm saying that was awesome, but I'm gonna say is Becca had giardia on it. I got shingles, and later on in the trip we had this incredible day of climbing in the minarets where we just raced up things and it was we were just in so lockstep. We're simul climbing, just charging. Had this incredible day climbing out in the minarets. And got down, we're walking on a hiking trail, and one of the switchbacks just caved in on Becca, and it just kind of crumbled, a kind of well-built switchback on the trail just went like that, and she just fell a little bit, and a rock rolled onto her hand and actually sliced deep into her palm and chipped the bone. And we had this we're not close to the road at that stage, definitely one of the biggest, getting all of our stuff. I think I was doing stuff for 24 straight hours or 27 straight hours of getting our stuff out, getting her out to the hospital, coming back, getting all of our crap, the whole thing. It was not a perfect trip, but that trip was amazing. And it really concluded in a very fitting fashion. There was this early season storm that came in that wasn't really forecasted. We left Tuolumne. We were like finishing it up to kind of go through the northern part of the Yosemite National Park, and then we're gonna go meet friends at the Incredible Hulk and spend the last like few days of the trip just kind of climbing the Hulk routes.
Cool.
And we were like, we went through the whole thing, and Becca at this stage, she couldn't climb anymore. She had 10 stitches and like was in a cast in her hand, but she like, it was like, we're going to meet our friends. And it was like, she wanted to finish the road, the walking portion of the whole thing. And we did that. And, we left Tuolumne, and it was like, oh yeah, forecast's good to go. There might be like a little rain this one afternoon. And instead we got a full shutdown blizzard, and we, it was like all there was no like satellite texting or anything like that. And,
right.
The rain rolled through, and we sat it out for a day, and we're like, oh, okay. We just, read books or whatever. And then the next day, like sometime in the night, it was like, oh, this is like for real. And we'd lived in Tahoe. We'd spent a bunch of time in the Sierra. So we kind of knew what the feel, like we like knew the visceral feelings of like what it's like when one of these storms rolls through. Cause we had experience. We'd been in the backcountry before, like when one of the sort of like late October storms can like roll through, and it just shuts it down for the whole year. I mean, it's just like, right. It's like 4 feet of snow falls, you're shut down. And so basically we woke up the next morning and we kind of realized like, oh man, we need to get the hell out of here. We're 20 miles from the trailhead. It's like legit snowing right now. And this is like for real. And we had this like epic, we were kind of like right at tree line where we camped. And so we like got quickly above tree line, and it was just, the snow was starting to collect enough and it was like wide out enough that you would kind of get vertigo. And, if you like looked up to try to see what the trail was, you'd kind of get that feeling of like, ooh, okay. Have to like look back down at your feet, you'd kind of like poke around on the trail. And, we're at this stage, like there's no, like we didn't have Garmin's or anything like that. It was just like map and compass, like work in a full whiteout of being like, okay, I think this is where it is. And, we didn't have like heavy gear at all. So like we did not have like the clothes to be out in this sort of sustained level for like multiple days. Our bodies were pretty wrecked from like having done the whole trip. Like I was the lightest I think I'd ever really been as an adult. And like we were just like so thin. And I just remember like starting to lose the trail and just being like, man, we need this trail. And in general, we had the sense of like, oh, if we go this way, we'll find it. But like finding the sort of like little tiny pass where we'd make it over to the Hulk, it was an endeavor, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And it was this crazy moment where it was like someone had just dropped these deer tracks like out of the sky for me. And I just was like, this deer knows where it's going. Like it will like know where the pass is. And instead of like trying to find this like trail in this like otherwise like ankle breaking talus, which now I can't say anymore because it's like under a foot of snow. Right. I'm gonna trust that this deer knows what the hell it's doing. And I just followed these like tracks out and like it made it to the pass. And then at that stage, like we like could tie into like, we were like, okay, there it is. And like for like one moment, like a mountain came out and we're like, okay, let's go that way. That'll be like the little cut through that we like get through to then you get like over this notch to get into the next basin that'll get us to the Hulk. And it all like somehow worked. And it was like that metaphor of having to place some sort of layer of trust in the universe. People can interpret that however they want to. I don't worry about that, but I think that layer of just like, of being like, sometimes you just gotta like believe it'll work. That's stuck with me for so long. And I think I was able to carry that like into that struggle with the creativity. Being like, yeah, there's a version where that doesn't work out. There's a version of that where it's like we have to be like rescued out of the Sierra, which a lot of other people, like I think like 5 or 6 other people did have to be like evacuated out of the Sierra that storm. We were fortunate not to have that happen to us, but I think there's just that reality of sometimes of just like, I just have this instinct that this will work if I keep pressing and following that through. And I think that's a great example of like, where I was at in my life of like all this uncertainty of like, will this thing I'm doing work? Will this thing that Becca and I are building together actually be sustainable? Because there wasn't a job called podcasting. There wasn't a job called like creating internet television shows. Like that was all new at that stage. Right. And I think some of that carried over deeply into sort of the like, we're going to figure out how to build the life we want to lead, And at that stage, it did mean settling down. It did mean having kids. It did mean, building a business together. And I think there was just that layer of like, well, let's just give it a try and believe in it. And it'll become obvious, like, if it's not going to work. And I think that's just been my whole thing, right? I think that's like the true of climbing. It's like a lot of times, like, this isn't going to work. Like we often, like, sometimes we'll like thwart ourselves and bail when we shouldn't bail. But like when you truly are like, no, I had to bail, you're like, I had to bail, like you
Right.
kind of know when it happens. And I think that's always been my mantra is like, let's go as far as we can until it's like totally clear that we probably need to like tie two ropes together and go down,
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, that's just kind of one of those big lessons that's been carried through from my time in the mountains. And some days I'm not into it, and sometimes I bail too. But like, that's not always how I roll in the mountains. But like there's days where I'm having fun, and there's days where you're gonna go do difficult things. And I think I just always like wait to the moment where it's like really clear versus like talking yourself out of something like earlier in the process.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that story, which again is in the book, but also just the additional context there is really nice. And yeah, one can't come out of an experience like that unchanged. And I'm glad you haven't tied the two ropes together on the creative side or didn't bail and you found your proverbial deer tracks through, the madness of podcasting and storytelling and creating all of these works, because they've just been such inspiration and such a joy in my life. And I think so many others as well. And dude, it's just been such a pleasure, man. I really appreciate you sharing these stories. And for anybody who's listening right now, you got to check out the book. The holidays are coming up here, so grab a copy of States of Adventure from Fitz. I'm sure you can get them wherever you get books. Support your local bookstore if you can. And Fitz, man, I'm really grateful. Thanks for sharing these stories today and just for all you've done, for the past 18 years.
Thanks for having me on, Ryan. I appreciate it. I appreciate being included in your community, and like I feel like honored to be here. And it's like you have such the sort of the learnings you've like gleaned out of like so many of the incredible talented athletes in our sport. It's just, yeah. So thanks for including me in this whole project that you're creating.
All right, that wraps things up with our buddy Fitz Cahall, an absolute legend in the adventure, podcast, and storytelling space. I really love this conversation. I hope you did too. I've actually listened to it a couple of times because I just find myself certain days wondering like, okay, do I want to like push myself physically as hard as I can to go send the hardest thing? Or do I want to go out and just have a crazy, wild adventure that pushes me out of my comfort zone in different ways and maybe offers up just a totally different experience? And I think the answer is yes. Just yes, do it all, do both of it. So loved this conversation. And also, again, shout out for his book, States of Adventure. Check it out. You can get it in a couple of days from Penguin or from probably Amazon. Obviously, if you can, support at your local bookstore. It's a really, really wonderful coffee table book or nighttime read. The photos and the essays are just beautiful. So thank you again, Fitz. Can't wait to talk to you some more in the future. And for those of you who want more Fitz, you can have it right now because we do have a fantastic bonus conversation. We talked for a while longer after we wrapped up this initial conversation, and we just talked through a gamut of other topics. So he gave some podcast recommendations that I found, by the way, non-climbing related podcast recommendations that I've been just burning through as I've been doing a lot of traveling these last few weeks here. Some really gripping, like, crime serial shows that I hadn't listened to, and they're fantastic. What's coming up next season for Climbing Gold? He answers a listener question about Alex Honnold and if Honnold is actually as fearless as he comes off. And Fitz knows Honnold really, really well, and I actually found that part of his response to that question to be pretty interesting. And obviously, Honnold is just like such an interesting character. So always good to get a glimpse behind that Honnold curtain. He also answers other questions about whether he feels it's better to go deep in one sport or go wide and experience a bunch of different sports. With climbing growing so fast, how can we all experience the quieter and the wilder side of this sport like people used to do maybe a decade ago or 20 years ago? And he had some great pointers on that. And also Fitz shares the adventure trip that he would take every single year if he could, and is accessible to everyone regardless of physical ability I'm going to be planning this trip with my family, and I can't wait to do it, hopefully this summer. You can get instant access to all of that right now at zero cost, actually, with a free trial over at patreon.com/thestruggleclimbing-show, or right there in your Apple Podcast player if you are an iPhone person. And you're also going to get instant access to more than 60 hours of other bonus content featuring the best of the best. Adam Ondra, Chris Sharma, Nina Williams, Alex Honnold, and so many more athletes and coaches that have been on the show here. Plus, pro clinics on stronger fingers with Dr. Tyler Nelson, advanced bouldering with Allison Vest, moonboard with Ravioli Biceps, performance hacks with Hazel Finley, and so many more. It's all there for just a few bucks a month, or actually zero cost right now with that free trial, so you can try it before you buy it. Although, honestly, your support as patrons and subscribers is really what helps to keep this thing going. So if you got a few bucks, I certainly would appreciate your help as I'm jamming away here in the podcast/utility closet. Thank you. I love you. Big thanks and appreciation to all of our show sponsors who have brought you this episode here at zero cost. Way to go. You can check your show notes for links and special discounts from those guys that are only available to Struggle listeners, and there's some great discounts there, so check them all out. Actually, you can see all of the show's brand sponsors and special deals by popping over to thestruggleclimbingshow.com/deals. Hey, did you know that The Struggle is carbon neutral in partnership with the Honnold Foundation? Well, you do now, and it feels pretty good for me to write that check every month. They're doing such amazing work to bring clean energy to communities around the world. Y'all can get inspired and learn more about their amazing work over at honnoldfoundation.org, and toss them some love if you can. They're doing awesome stuff. And lastly, The Struggle is a proud member of the Plugtone Audio Collective, a diverse group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. The show is produced and hosted by me, Ryan Devlin, and edited by the wonderful Glenn Walker. All right, that clips the anchors on this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting the show. If you want to do something that helps me out for zero cost, you could rate and review the show wherever you listen, or just share this with one of your climbing friends or the gym that you climb at. It really helps to get the word out there. I appreciate it. I hope your training and climbing are going great, and if you are struggling like me, well, just remember the struggle makes us stronger.